Hey guys! So in this video we are going to talk about the things that I try to consider before I start depending on a new library. So let's get into it. Now I am going to start off by saying that not all of this is universally true for, say, front end or back end or something like that. It kind of depends. I would say that on average, I think that the considerations that I'm going to present to you are fairly universal, with one major exception, and that is that, and this is actually the thing that I find that most developers overlook as a consideration when they're working in front end versus back end. Now, most times the considerations that you should have for depending on a third-party library should be fairly similar, but when you work in front end, you also have to consider the size of the dependency, the dependency itself. Now, you can make an argument that this is important on the back end as well, and to a degree that is true, that having a lot of code is, it's not a great thing. Like, ideally you should always go for to have as little code as you can possibly have. The mentality you go after is basically that code is the cost that you pay in order to get the functionality that your software is offering. So in other words, the less code you have, statistically the less bugs you have, statistically the less problems you have, etc., etc. However, in front end, since you are sending for the most part web assets to, say, to a browser, there's a little bit of there's a bigger hit to your performance. Yes, sure, a big library on the server is not a great thing, but it's not going to have as much of an impact as if you have a really big library on the front end, because you're not sending something from the back end. You're not sending that code to the front end. Once it's in memory, you're fine. So have that in mind. Usually the size of the library does factor in a lot more when you work in front end. But apart from that, let's talk about the actual considerations. So the first thing I always ask myself before I start looking into a third-party library is, okay, what is the scope of this application? That's number one. Always ask yourself, what type of application am I building? Like, what's the scope? Because if you are building something that is going to require a lot of effort over time, you will have to have different considerations as opposed to having something that is very small. A good example of this is, say that I'm just gonna, like, a classic example is you're going to make this tiny little, say, Node.js server, right? And let's say, for the sake of argument, that you're just going to make it be a proxy, basically, or a static file server that's going to serve up one single page, say your personal blog. Most people that I see will default to simply using Express, which is a very good choice. There's nothing wrong with using Express for that. But I personally think that, okay, if I only have a single endpoint and all I'm going to do is send up a single file or proxy every single request that goes through my server to somewhere else, wherever it's heading, and maybe add some headers or something, why would I need Express? I know it's fairly lightweight, but Node has native support for handling some basic routes and doing all of that stuff, so I don't really need Express as a dependency. So in that scenario, I usually just use Vanilla Node, the HTTP module from Vanilla Node. However, let's say that I have a customer who say a big customer, like at my company, we work towards banks and so forth. Like, if I'm working with a bank, well, that's a very different scenario. I know that my project is going to be very big and it's most likely going to live for a very, very long time. So now I have to really consider the things that will affect my long-term health of the long-term health of the project. And that's when you really start to think about libraries, and you have to kind of think about what's a good library, what's a bad library. And the most important thing, in my personal opinion, is this. Some people will make the argument that, or rather, I personally think this is a mistake. I really do. I see it a lot. I see these obscure little up-and-coming libraries or tools and stuff of that nature, and I see developers bet their entire business on these on these libraries because they have been sold the idea that these libraries are doing something much better than somebody else. Now, one of my absolute favorite examples of this is if we talk about languages. At the language level, you have people who will say that, yeah, no, for example, I'm gonna write my entire application in F# because that's such a cool and functional language and it's awesome and so forth. And they do, and a few years down the road they realize that shit, I have to pay my developers twice as much and I only have maybe 5 or maybe 3 candidates a year for that position. Had I gone with, say, Java, I would still have been able to produce the code and I would have had a bigger range of other benefits. Like, those are the sort of considerations you should have when you're picking a language. So with that being said, if we just consider the library aspects of the whole thing, I ask myself, okay, and this is actually very tricky when it comes to estimating how big the scope of the application is, because this comes with experience, guys. I know I've been the guy who's been telling you that you don't try to think ahead too much, like don't try to make like decisions right now that is going to be right for times to come, because the odds are that you're going to get it wrong. And this is true, like very often you will get it wrong, but with experience comes a sixth sense. It's like a gut feeling. I'll give you an example. Now, I know that if I'm gonna work against like a really big client, say, as I said, a bank or something like that, and I'm going to found a company around an application, a web application, I know that I'm gonna need a routing system. And it's I know I'm going to have different URLs and routes and so forth. That means that I have now a decision to make. I can either build my own routing system, or I can use a library. And this is where my considerations start to really kind of, at least this is how I think about it. I ask myself, okay, how much time and how much risk does it pose for me to build this myself, as opposed to depending on it as a third-party library. Now, a routing system is a big, complicated thing to build, just like a testing framework. These are big tools. These are the sort of tools that you, like building them yourselves, that's an entire application in of itself. So it's very easy for me to say, yeah, I'm gonna need a library for this. However, if there's this small little obscure library, say like, I don't know, it's such a hard thing to I can't really pull anything out right now that is going to be like a good fit, because I don't want to trash talk any library either. But like the consideration I have is that the amount of time that I'm going to save by using this library very much outweighs the amount of risk it poses to my project. So these are usually the sort of libraries that I add. And I try to always consider not what is maybe the peak performance sort of thing. It's more about what is going to holistically be the best thing long term. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that there are tools out there that do the same sort of thing, but some tools are more adopted and widespread, and that's actually a good thing, even though they may not be the best things in terms of, like, say, performance or any other aspect. My favorite example of this is something like Chef, for example. Now, Chef is a tool for, let's just call it infrastructure. There's so much stuff that you can do with Chef. Chef is like Chef, SaltStack, Puppeteer, Ansible, like all these different tools that help you with your infrastructure. Now, Chef is arguably the biggest brand of these. It's not the best, depending on your viewpoint, but it's a very big brand. And that's actually very useful if you are going to depend on one of these things. The reason why it's useful is because unless you have a really good reason to choose something that is less popular or less widespread, why not go with the obvious popular thing? Because if you do, you will have more learning resources, you will have more people available to you. Like there's all these subtle benefits to having something that is really popular and mainstream. And it's the same thing I tell people about choosing React or Angular over something else, because although they may not be the peak performance best, I mean, there are libraries for front-end development or SPAs coming out almost every week, and there's tons of them that are faster, like Preact, for example. But why would you use Preact if you have no other, like if the only reason is that it's more performant? That's simply not good enough, because the question is not, is it more performant? The question is there some downside with using React or Angular that is so great that you're willing to trade the risk a smaller, less mainstream library poses to the rest of your project? Because remember, it's not just about that one thing that you think is so important. It's more about the long health of your project. That's why I say to people that Java is very popular in the enterprise world, because it's very safe. It's not the best choice for every situation, but it's so damn safe, and that's something that is very valuable when you're going to have a project that lives for a long time. So these are the main considerations that I have when I pick a library or a tool that I'm going to depend on. So what I want you to take away from this is that the first and foremost question you have to ask yourself, what's the scope of the project? If it's a very small project, I try to go as light as humanly possible on libraries. The second thing you need to think about is if it's a bigger project and it's going to live for a long time, try to only depend on the libraries that you know have, like the way it's going to take you too much time to build it yourself, and odds are that you're going to get it wrong. Like for example, Rust does not have as of this moment, a time library, and implementing my own time library to handle dates and stuff like that, that's way too much work. So there's a nice little project called the Chrono, and that's a crate that I can depend on. That's worth it, because I can't build that thing myself in a reasonable amount of time. Same thing with Jest or Angular or React in front end. Like there are these libraries that are really big and creates a lot of value for you and saves you a lot of time. Thirdly, don't pick small, tiny, super cool libraries. Pick the big supported things unless you have a very good reason to not do so, because trust me, software development is about more than blazing performance. It's about more than functional programming, and it's about more than this obscure little reason why this single thing is so much better than everything else. Trust me, there are more factors to consider than what most likely that very tiny little library is trying to sell you on. Having a big brand, a well-known established tool that a lot of people know, is actually almost always better than having something that is super, super specialized and super, super performant and very unadopted. Just in general. If you know what you're doing, of course, ignore what I'm saying. But those are generally the rules that I have when I consider a library. Have a great day.